My parents handed my brother the keys to the family restaurant on a Sunday afternoon, in front of 40 relatives, with a cake that said, "Congratulations, Daniel," in blue icing. I was standing by the drinks table when my father made the announcement. He raised his glass and said Daniel had earned this. He said Daniel had always been the one who truly understood what the restaurant meant to this family. And then he looked directly at me, still holding his glass, and said something I have not been able to fully shake since. "Some people contribute in their own way," he said. "And some people carry the real weight." I had been making the loan payment on that restaurant for 3 years. Not Daniel. Not my parents. Me. Nobody at that party knew that. My father didn't know it. My mother didn't know it. Daniel certainly didn't know it, standing there in his brand new apron, accepting hugs from relatives who had no idea that the building under his feet was still, legally and financially, standing on payments I had been making quietly every single month since I was 26 years old. I smiled. I clapped when everyone else clapped. I ate a piece of the cake, the blue icing sweet and slightly too thick the way grocery store cakes always are. And 3 days later I called the bank. My name is Renee Castillo, and this is the story of what happened when I finally stopped paying for a restaurant my parents had just given away to someone else, without ever once telling anyone what it had actually cost to keep that restaurant alive. If you've ever quietly held something together while someone else got the credit for it, I think you're going to understand every part of what I'm about to tell you. Subscribe right now because this is exactly the kind of story this channel exists to tell. New story every single day. Let's get into it. I need to tell you about my father before I tell you about the restaurant because you cannot separate the two. My father, Manuel Castillo, came to this country at 19 years old with almost nothing, the way that particular generation story so often goes, and spent the next 30 years working in other people's kitchens before he ever considered the possibility of having one of his own. He worked his way from dishwasher to line cook to sous chef across a string of restaurants that no longer exist, restaurants whose names I only know because he mentioned them occasionally, with a specific fondness that suggested they taught him something even as he eventually outgrew them. He always said the same thing whenever the subject of his own restaurant came up at family dinners. One day he'd have a place with his name on it, a place where people came specifically for his food rather than whoever happened to be cooking that night. The year I turned 23, that one day finally arrived. My father had been saving for nearly a decade, supplementing his savings with a small inheritance from my grandmother and, eventually, a business loan that felt, at the time, like a reasonable and manageable risk. Castillo's kitchen opened in a modest strip mall on the east side of town, between a nail salon and a check cashing place, the kind of unglamorous location that real estate agents describe as having tremendous foot traffic potential, without quite admitting that the foot traffic mostly belongs to people running errands rather than seeking out a new favorite restaurant. I remember the opening week clearly. My father wore his chef's coat, freshly pressed, for every single shift, even the slow Tuesday afternoons when the dining room sat mostly empty. My mother quit her job at the dental office where she'd worked for 11 years to manage the front of house, learning the rhythm of seating and ordering and the particular diplomacy required when a regular customer complains about a wait time during the dinner rush. I was proud of them. I want to say that clearly because everything that follows can sometimes read like a story about resentment, and I don't want you to think that resentment was ever the starting point. I was proud, genuinely, watching two people in their 50s take an enormous financial risk on a dream my father had been carrying since he was 19 years old. The first year was hard but survivable. The second year was harder. By the third year, the slow bleed I mentioned at the start had become impossible to ignore, the kind of financial pressure that doesn't announce itself dramatically but instead accumulates quietly, month after month, until the gap between revenue and obligations becomes a permanent, exhausting feature of daily life rather than a temporary problem to be solved. My father came to me on a Tuesday evening in October, 3 years into the restaurant's life, looking smaller than I had ever seen him look. He had never, in my entire life up to that point, asked me for anything financial. The roles in our family had always run in the other direction, the way they're supposed to run between parents and children, at least until the children are old enough that the direction sometimes needs to reverse. He sat across from me at my own kitchen table, in the small apartment I'd been renting since college, and he told me carefully that the restaurant's loan payment was 3 weeks late, and that if it went much longer, the bank had started using language about default that he didn't fully understand but understood enough to be frightened by. I had just started my first real job out of college, an entry-level accounting position at a regional firm that paid modestly but consistently, the kind of salary that felt enormous after years of student budgeting but that I now recognize in retrospect was barely enough to comfortably cover my own expenses, let alone someone else's. I said yes anyway, almost without hesitation, because the alternative, watching my father lose something he had worked 30 years to build, was simply not something I was prepared to allow if I had any capacity to prevent it. I want to be precise about the arrangement we made because the precision matters to everything that followed. I didn't write a single check that first time, hand it over dramatically with conditions attached. I simply set up a recurring automatic transfer from my checking account directly to the loan servicer, the same amount on the same date every single month, removing myself almost entirely from the transaction after that initial setup. This was, I think now, both a kindness and a mistake. A kindness because it meant my parents never had to ask me again, never had to experience the specific discomfort of repeatedly requesting help from their own child. A mistake because it also meant the payment simply became invisible, a background process that nobody but me and my bank statements ever had reason to think about. A few months became a year. A year became 2. 2 years became 3. I want to spend some time explaining why I never told anyone because I think the reasons matter, and because I've examined them extensively in the years since, trying to understand my own choices with the same clarity I eventually demanded from my family. Part of it, honestly, was pride. There is a particular kind of help that becomes complicated the moment it's acknowledged, because acknowledgement creates an obligation, a debt that the person being helped suddenly has to carry alongside whatever burden the help was meant to relieve. I didn't want my parents to feel that they owed me something every time we sat down to dinner. I wanted the restaurant's survival to feel like a family achievement, not a transaction with a quiet creditor sitting at the table. Part of it was love, genuinely uncomplicated love for the dream my father had carried since he was 19 years old. I believed in Castillo's kitchen. I believed it deserved to survive, independent of any credit I might receive for helping it do so. And part of it, the part I'm most honest about now, was a quiet, persistent hope that someday, somehow, someone would simply notice. That my father would look at the bank statements himself one month, or my mother would ask a question that led somewhere revealing, or the universe would simply arrange circumstances such that my contribution became visible without my ever having to be the one to announce it. Nobody ever noticed. For 3 years across 36 separate payments, nobody in my family ever asked a single question about how the restaurant's loan was staying current during a period when every other financial indicator suggested it shouldn't have been. I think looking back, this says something important about how families sometimes operate. We build narratives about who contributes and how, and once those narratives solidify, they become remarkably resistant to contradicting evidence. My family's narrative was simple. My parents had built the restaurant and they were managing it, perhaps with some difficulty, but managing it themselves. There was no room in that narrative for a quiet third party keeping the entire structure standing. And so the evidence of my involvement simply never registered as something worth investigating. I need to tell you about my brother Daniel because understanding him is essential to understanding what happened at that party. Daniel is 2 years younger than me, and for most of our 20s, he existed in a particular kind of holding pattern that I think many younger siblings experience, the specific drift that happens when you haven't yet found the thing that organizes your ambition. He worked in sales for a software company for 18 months before the position was eliminated in a round of layoffs. He managed a friend's gym for almost a year before the friend sold the business to someone who brought in their own management team. He tried, briefly and without much conviction, to build a social media marketing business that never quite generated enough clients to become sustainable. I want to be fair to Daniel here because I think it's easy in a story like this one to make him into a caricature of unearned privilege, and that's not actually accurate. Daniel wasn't lazy. He was searching in the specific, sometimes painful way that takes longer for some people than others, and our parents, to their credit, never criticized him publicly for the searching the way they sometimes, gently but unmistakably, criticized me for working too much and visiting too little. Daniel started helping at the restaurant about 14 months before that Sunday party. Initially just covering occasional weekend shifts when my parents needed extra hands during their busiest periods. I remember my father's face the first time Daniel successfully managed a full Saturday dinner rush on his own, the specific brightness that crossed his expression, a pride that I recognized immediately because I had wanted to see that exact expression directed at me for most of my adult life and had largely stopped expecting it. Over the following year, Daniel's involvement deepened considerably. He learned the kitchen's rhythms. He developed real relationships with the regular customers. He started contributing ideas about the menu, some of which my father actually implemented, a small but significant signal of trust that I noticed and, I'll admit, felt something complicated about noticing. I don't think I ever resented Daniel directly during this period. What I resented, slowly and then with increasing clarity, was the story my parents had begun constructing around his involvement, a story in which Daniel represented the family's true future, the child who had finally found his calling specifically in continuing what our father had built, while I remained in the unspoken architecture of that story, simply the practical one, the responsible one, the one who had her own life elsewhere and visited when she could. Nobody mentioned in that story that the restaurant Daniel was so beautifully stepping into existed at all because of payments that had nothing to do with anyone's emotional investment in the family legacy and everything to do with 36 consecutive automatic transfers from an account they'd never thought to ask about. My mother's 60th birthday party took place on a Sunday afternoon in late spring, at the restaurant itself, which my parents had closed for the occasion and decorated with string lights and the specific abundance of food that characterizes every Castillo family gathering I've ever attended. I drove the 4 hours from where I now lived, having moved for a promotion 2 years earlier, a move that had, I think, contributed to the narrative of distance that made it easier for my parents to mentally categorize Daniel as the present child and me as the absent one, regardless of what either of us was actually doing to support the family in less visible ways. The party itself was warm and genuinely joyful for most of its duration. 40 or so relatives and family friends filled the restaurant's dining room. The same tables where my father had served his first nervous customer 7 years earlier now covered in birthday decorations and the specific chaos of a celebration that had clearly been planned with considerable care. I was standing near the drinks table, refilling a cup of horchata, when my father stood up at the head of the longest table and tapped his glass with a spoon, the universal signal that an announcement was coming. "I have something I want to share with everyone today," he said, his voice carrying the particular formality he reserved for moments he'd clearly rehearsed. "As most of you know, this restaurant has been my dream for most of my life. And I am proud, more proud than I can properly express, to announce that I'm passing full ownership of Castillo's Kitchen to my son Daniel." The room erupted into applause. Daniel, standing near the kitchen entrance in a new apron I would later learn my mother had purchased specifically for this moment, looked genuinely moved, his eyes wet, accepting the applause with the particular humility of someone who hadn't fully expected the magnitude of the gesture. My father continued, once the applause settled. "Daniel has earned this. Over this past year he has shown me every single day that he understands what this restaurant means, not just as a business, but as this family's legacy. He shows up. He works the hard shifts. He's learned every corner of this kitchen the way I learned it myself 30 years ago, in someone else's restaurant. And then he looked at me. I want to describe this moment precisely, because I have replayed it many times since, trying to understand exactly what was happening behind his expression. Some people contribute in their own way," he said, his eyes still on me. "And some people carry the real weight. I don't believe even now that my father meant this cruelly. I believe with as much generosity as I can extend to the moment, that in his mind the real weight he was describing was the physical and emotional labor Daniel had visibly demonstrated over the preceding year, the early mornings and late nights and the sweat-soaked apparent commitment that anyone in that room could observe directly. What my father could not see, what nobody in that room could see, was the weight I had been carrying invisibly from 4 hours away every single month for 3 consecutive years, the weight that had actually kept the building standing long enough for Daniel to ever have the opportunity to inherit it at all. I smiled. I clapped along with everyone else. I walked over and hugged Daniel, genuinely happy for him in a complicated, layered way that I'm still not entirely sure how to fully untangle even now. I ate a piece of the cake, the blue icing sweet and slightly too thick the way grocery store cake icing always is, and I drove the 4 hours home that evening with a specific kind of quiet sitting in my chest that I didn't yet have words for. I want to walk you through the 3 days between that party and my phone call to the bank, because I think the texture of those days matters considerably to understanding what eventually happened. The first day I simply felt hurt, in the uncomplicated, raw way that doesn't yet have any analytical structure to it. I went to work. I answered emails. I existed inside the specific fog of having absorbed something painful that I hadn't yet processed enough to discuss with anyone. The second day, I called my closest friend from college, a woman named Priya who had known my family for nearly 15 years and who listened, with the particular patience she'd always brought to my occasional crises, while I explained what had happened, the announcement, the cake, the specific sentence my father had said while looking directly at me. "Did you ever tell them?" Priya asked once I'd finished. "About the payments?" "No," I said. "Why not?" I gave her the same answer I've given you, the pride and the love and the quiet hope that someone would eventually notice on their own. "Renee," she said after a long pause, "I love you, but you cannot expect people to notice something you've specifically structured to be invisible. You set up an automatic transfer specifically so nobody would have to think about it. That worked exactly as designed. The cost of that design is that nobody ever did think about it." I sat with that observation for a long time after we hung up. It was, I think, the precise moment when my hurt began transforming into something with more structure to it, something closer to clarity than simple pain. The third day I called the bank. I want to walk through this phone call in detail, because the specific mechanics of what I learned that day changed the entire trajectory of what followed. I called the loan servicing department, intending, I genuinely believed at the time, simply to ask a practical administrative question. Now that ownership of the restaurant had officially transferred to Daniel, was there a process for updating the loan records to reflect the new owner, separate from my own involvement as the person who had been covering the payments? The representative who took my call was a woman named Patricia, careful and methodical in the way that good loan officers tend to be, the kind of professional thoroughness that comes from having seen enough financial situations to know that the surface question is rarely the complete picture. She pulled up the account and was quiet for a moment longer than seemed purely administrative. "I want to make sure I understand correctly," she said. "You've personally been making these payments. Not from the business account associated with the loan. From your own personal checking account every single month for the past 3 years." "Yes," I said. "Since I was 26. And the new owner, your brother, has he been added to the loan documentation in any way? Has there been any restructuring filed reflecting the ownership transfer?" "No," I said. "As far as I know, the loan is still entirely in my parents' names, the way it's been since the restaurant opened. My brother just received ownership of the business itself informally at a family event." Patricia was quiet again, and when she spoke next, her voice carried a different quality, more careful, the tone of someone delivering information she suspected would matter considerably to the person hearing it. "Miss Castillo, I have to flag something important here. If business ownership has been transferred, but the loan itself hasn't been formally restructured to reflect that transfer, that creates a significant compliance issue. The terms of this loan require that the borrower of record and the legal owner of the business be the same entity. Right now, your parents are the borrowers of record, but if your brother now legally owns the business, that's no longer accurate, and it needs to be resolved." "What does resolved mean practically?" I asked. "It means either your parents need to formally retain ownership on paper, which doesn't sound like what anyone wants given what you've described, or your brother needs to go through a process of being added to or assuming the loan, which would require a credit and financial review on his end. Until that happens, the account is technically out of compliance with its own terms." I asked her what happened if nobody addressed this discrepancy. "Eventually, if it's flagged in a routine review, the bank could call the loan," she said, "meaning the full remaining balance becomes due immediately, rather than continuing as scheduled monthly payments." "What's the remaining balance?" I asked, though some part of me already suspected the answer would be substantial. "A little over $81,000, she said. I sat with that number for a long moment. "I have a more specific question," I said eventually. "Is there a way for me to simply be removed as the person responsible for making these payments? I'm not trying to create a crisis. I just don't think it's appropriate for me to continue covering a loan attached to a business I have no ownership stake in whatsoever." "Absolutely," Patricia said. "I can send you a form to formally discontinue your authorization as the payer on this account. Once that's processed, the payment responsibility reverts entirely to the borrowers of record, your parents, and they'll need to determine with your brother how to handle the loan going forward given the ownership change." I asked her to send me the form. I want to be honest with you about something. In the days after that call, I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel the particular satisfaction that revenge narratives often promise. I felt mostly a kind of exhausted clarity, the specific feeling of finally setting down something heavy that you've been carrying for so long you'd forgotten it was optional. I signed the form Patricia sent me and returned it within 2 days. I did not call my parents to explain what I'd done. I did not send a dramatic text message announcing my decision. I simply let the automatic transfer that had been running for 3 years quietly stop, and I waited to see what would happen next. What happened next was that the bank, following its standard procedures, sent a missed payment notice to my parents' address, the only address officially associated with the loan, approximately 3 weeks after I discontinued my authorization. My mother called me on a Tuesday evening, her voice carrying a specific confusion that I recognized as the early stages of someone encountering information that doesn't yet fit into their existing understanding of the situation. "We got a strange letter from the bank," she said, "about a missed payment on the restaurant loan. I don't understand it. We haven't been making those payments directly in years. The automatic transfer has always just handled it." I felt my chest tighten, the specific physical sensation of a moment you've anticipated finally arriving. "Mom," I said, "the automatic transfer you're referring to is coming from my account. I've been the one making those payments since I was 26. For 3 years. The silence on the line lasted long enough that I genuinely wondered if the call had dropped. "What do you mean your account?" she finally said. "I mean exactly that," I said. "When Dad came to me 3 years ago, worried about the loan falling behind, I set up an automatic transfer from my own checking account to cover it. Every month. I never told anyone because I didn't want it to feel like a transaction. I just wanted to help." 3 years, she repeated, the number apparently taking time to fully process. "Since I was 26, I said again. "Why didn't you say something?" she asked, and I could hear, underneath the confusion, something that sounded almost like hurt, the particular hurt of discovering that your child has been carrying something significant without your knowledge. "I think I wanted you to notice on your own eventually," I said. I don't know if that was fair to expect. But after the party, after Dad said what he said about who carries the real weight, I realized I couldn't keep doing this invisibly anymore. Not while Daniel gets credit for showing up to a restaurant that I was the one actually keeping financially alive. My father called approximately an hour later. I had been expecting this call, bracing for it in the specific way you brace for a conversation you know is necessary but dread anyway. I want to tell you honestly that I had imagined this conversation many different ways in the days leading up to it, some versions involving raised voices and accusations, the dramatic confrontation that makes for satisfying narrative structure. The actual conversation was nothing like that. My father was quiet, mostly the particular quiet of a man processing information that requires him to reconsider something he believed he understood completely. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice lacking the formal cadence he'd used at the party, sounding instead simply tired and confused. I gave him the same explanation I'd given my mother, the pride and the love and the quiet hope that recognition would arrive without my having to demand it. "I said something at the party," he said, and I understood he was referring to the comment about carrying the real weight. "I need you to know I wasn't trying to dismiss what you've done for this family. I genuinely didn't know there was anything to dismiss. I thought Daniel's hard work at the restaurant was the thing nobody else in the family had stepped up to do. I understand that now," I said. "But I think that's exactly the problem. I structured my help to be invisible, and invisible help doesn't get factored into anyone's understanding of who's contributing what. I made a choice that had consequences I didn't fully think through." "What happens now?" he asked. "With the loan?" "That's actually not for me to decide anymore," I said. "I've removed myself as the payer. The responsibility is back with you and Mom as the official borrowers, which means you and Daniel need to figure out together how the loan gets handled now that he actually owns the business." $81,000, my father said, and I understood he'd already spoken with the bank himself, or perhaps Patricia had been required to disclose the figure once the missed payment triggered a review. "Renee, I had no idea it was that much remaining. I thought, with the payment staying current all these years, we must have been close to paying it off. I was making the minimum payment," I said. "Enough to keep it current, not enough to make significant progress against the principal. I didn't have the resources to do more than that, not on my salary." He was quiet again, and when he spoke next, his voice carried something I hadn't expected, a specific vulnerability that I rarely heard from him. "I'm ashamed," he said. "Not of you. Of myself. Of how easily I built a story in my head about who in this family was carrying what, without ever actually checking whether that story was true. I learned, through my mother, that Daniel found out about the loan situation gradually over the following week, as my parents worked through the practical reality of what the ownership transfer actually meant now that the financial structure underneath it had become visible. Daniel called me directly about 10 days after the party, his voice carrying none of the bright confidence I'd observed in him while wearing his new apron. "I didn't know," he said, almost immediately, before I'd even finished saying hello. "Renee, I swear to you, I had absolutely no idea you'd been covering the loan. I thought Mom and Dad had it handled. I never once thought to ask how the payments were actually being managed." "I believe you," I said, and I meant it. I had never actually suspected Daniel of knowingly accepting credit for something he understood I was secretly funding. The structure of my own silence had made that kind of knowledge impossible for anyone in the family to access. "What happens now?" he asked. "With the $81,000? "That's between you, Mom and Dad," I said. "I'm not in a position to tell you what to do, and honestly, I don't think it's fair for me to be involved in solving a problem I've spent 3 years quietly solving by myself without anyone's knowledge or input." "I don't know if I can take this on," Daniel said, and I could hear underneath the words a kind of genuine fear that I recognized, because it mirrored some of what I'd felt 3 years earlier when our father first asked me for help. "I don't have that kind of money. I don't know if the restaurant generates enough to cover that on top of everything else." "Then maybe that's a conversation you need to have with Mom and Dad," I said, "about whether the ownership transfer needs to look different than it currently does, now that everyone actually understands the full financial picture." What ultimately happened over the following 2 months was a restructuring that none of us had anticipated at that birthday party, but that all of us, I think, came to understand was more honest than what had come before. Daniel went through a formal loan assumption process with the bank, which required him to submit financial documentation and undergo a credit review, the kind of scrutiny that the original informal handoff of ownership had entirely bypassed. This process revealed clearly and unambiguously that Daniel could not independently support the remaining loan balance on the restaurant's current revenue alone. My parents, faced with this reality, made the decision to remain co-signers on the restructured loan, sharing the formal financial responsibility with Daniel, rather than the informal arrangement where ownership had been transferred without the financial obligation following it. This meant my parents' retirement, which they had hoped, with the restaurant transition, to finally begin enjoying without daily operational responsibility, instead became entangled with the business for several more years at minimum. I want to be honest that this outcome created its own complicated emotions for me. Part of me felt a kind of vindication, the visible confirmation that the restaurant's survival had never been as simple as my father's narrative at the party suggested. But part of me also felt genuine sadness, watching my parents, now in their 60s, having to extend their own financial entanglement with a business they'd hoped to hand off cleanly. I offered eventually, about 6 weeks after everything had settled into its new structure, to resume a modified version of my contribution, a smaller monthly amount that would help ease the transition without recreating the exact invisible arrangement that had caused so much difficulty. But this time I made one condition explicit, the condition I should have made from the very beginning 3 years earlier. "I'll help," I told my parents, sitting at their kitchen table on a visit home, "but everyone needs to actually know about it. Not as a transaction with strings attached. Just as something visible, something we're doing together, rather than something I'm doing quietly, while someone else gets to be the family's understanding of who's contributing." They agreed. Daniel agreed. And for the first time in this entire saga, the help I offered existed in the open, acknowledged by everyone, rather than buried in an automatic transfer that nobody thought to ask about. I think about that birthday party often, the specific sentence my father said while looking directly at me, the cake with its slightly too thick blue icing, the particular ache of watching someone receive credit for something you had quietly made possible. I don't think my father is a villain in this story. I think he genuinely believed the narrative he'd constructed, the story where Daniel's visible labor represented the family's real contribution to the restaurant's survival. The story felt true to him because the evidence that would have contradicted it had been carefully, deliberately hidden by me for 3 consecutive years. This is the part of the story I keep returning to in my own reflection. I structured my help specifically to avoid acknowledgement, and then I felt hurt when that acknowledgement never arrived. Both of those things were real and valid feelings, but I had to eventually recognize that I bore some responsibility for the gap between them, in a way that complicates any simple narrative of pure victimhood. What I've learned in the time since is that quiet generosity, the kind that asks for nothing and expects nothing, sounds beautiful in theory but often creates exactly the conditions where your contribution becomes invisible to the people who most need to understand it. There is a difference between generosity that doesn't demand recognition and generosity that actively hides itself from any possibility of recognition. I had been practicing the second kind, and I had been surprised painfully when it produced exactly the outcome that kind of generosity logically produces. I don't regret helping my father's restaurant survive. I believe in what he built, and I'm genuinely glad it's still standing, now under a more honest financial structure than the one that existed before that birthday party. What I regret, if regret is even the right word, is the 3 years of silence that preceded the moment everything finally became visible. I regret structuring my love in a way that made it possible for my own family to construct an entire narrative about contribution and worth that simply didn't include me, not because they didn't value me, but because I had made myself invisible within the very story I was helping write. If you've ever quietly carried something while someone else received the credit for keeping it standing, I hope this story gave you something useful. Not necessarily permission to expose every quiet kindness you've ever offered, but maybe permission to ask yourself whether the silence you're choosing is actually serving the people you love, or simply protecting you from a vulnerability you haven't fully named yet. My name is Renee Castillo. The restaurant is still standing. My family understands now what it actually takes to keep it that way. Drop a comment if you've ever been the quiet one holding something together. Tell me what finally made it visible, or what's still keeping it hidden. Subscribe if you're new here. New story every single day. I'll see you in the next one.